Hi, everyone, and welcome to Psychology Lunch and Learn. This is our third one for the semester. It's our last one. We're going to talk today about reading research. We'll specifically talk about reading research articles and how to go about dissecting a research article, so to speak. So I recognize a few names, a few faces. So quite a few of you are in programs, or you will be required to complete a capstone project. And the capstone project calls for you to put together an evidence-based paper. So what does that mean? That means that you are writing a paper that is based on scientific findings and not based on secondary or tertiary sources. So that means you're going to need to know how to read a research article. You probably have a good idea already, but I'm going to give you some helpful hints, and I'll start off by talking about types of articles that are out there. So empirical articles or research articles are going to be articles that report methods and findings of basic, applied, and translational research. So this would be, for example, an article that tells you about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on school children. This would be an example, for example, an experiment where they look at the differences between cloth and surgical face masks to see whether there's a difference between the two. This would be research that is maybe intervention based. So this is the direct research, the actual research, not someone else's interpretation of the research. Another type of article is going to be a brief report. A brief report will be where we present preliminary findings, and it could be maybe 5 to 8 pages long, sometimes a little bit shorter, sometimes 2.5 pages. It depends on the journal, depends on the requirements. And this is going to present exploratory findings from research. It would present, for example, findings that have the potential to be significant, but that may require greater exploration in the future. Next, we have review articles or literature reviews. Literature reviews, review articles, these are going to be articles that synthesize and present a summary of the literature on a particular topic. So for example, you could have, I recently read a literature review that was examining the impact of aging on perceptions of women. And so it summarized a bunch of different studies on perceptions of women as they age. And that's an example of a review article or literature review. Next, we go to policy briefs. So policy briefs, those are going to describe findings from past research and provide directions for public policy. I have a policy brief that was just published last month that examines Black youth's mental health and proposes solutions to how to address it, and in particular looks at different frameworks and how they've been applied to examining Black youth's mental health. And that would be an example. So you're looking at a specific topic, you are looking at what was done in the past, you're thinking about new ways of looking at something, and you're talking about implications for future research and for future applied work. So case conferences are going to present behavioral history, assessment, and intervention plans. Case conferences are fairly rare. They are based on the original formula that Freud used. And they're fairly interesting. They're going to be about something that is not common. So for example, we might have a case conference on someone who is born without a cerebellum or something of that sort. So something very rare, but something that is notable and worth discussing. So we've talked about types of articles. Now let's talk about the actual anatomy of a research article. So what does a research article actually look like? And so you start off with the title, then you will have the author. Next, you'll have the abstract, you'll have the keywords. You start off with the introduction or literature review. The goal of the introduction and literature review, it's sometimes called the background and justification, is really to provide you a history of contemporary research on the topic and to give you an understanding of why this topic is worth studying and why the topic is relevant, really. So worth studying and relevant are not necessarily the same thing, but they go hand in hand. The literature review will typically be organized in a way where it presents the independent or predictor variables, and then it's going to present the dependent or result variables. You also will typically have a theoretical context that's presented, and you may start off the introduction with some interesting statistics on the topic. So after we get through the introduction/literature review, we go to the present study section. And that section is going to lay out really what the study is about and tell you what exactly is going to be done. It will typically contain the research questions, the hypotheses, sometimes both. We then get to the method section. The method section is basically the recipe. So the method section tells you exactly how they did their research, what instruments they used, who their participants were, what the rate of response was in some cases. It gives you full demographic information. The method section is going to be broken down into 3 particular areas. So you have a breakdown of the method section into, first, participants. The participant section is going to tell you about demographic information. So it'll tell you about the size of the N, so the size of the sample, and it'll also tell you about characteristics of the sample. So you'll get some information in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity and race, in terms of some sort of socioeconomic information. So it'll either be income or it could be SES that's actually measured, so socioeconomic status, which is going to be education, and occupation as opposed to income. So there's information that is actually required because APA standards, or the American Psychological Association standards, require you to report who your participants are and to provide full information about them so that we can understand whether or not the research is generalizable to other populations. So in the method section, you start with participants. Then you will have typically a section that tells you a little bit about procedures, or sometimes you go to measures. It depends. Some journals will specifically request a certain order. Other journals will allow you to follow a more traditional order. Something to keep in mind is that method sections are fairly standardized in the social sciences. In psychology, and I'm a psychologist, so that's why I'm speaking from a psychological perspective. In psychology, we tend to follow the same order just about every time. And if you can look at journal articles and diverse journal articles, whether they follow APA format or they follow MLA or Chicago or some other sort of formatting, they tend to all have, the same order. So it's going to be within the method section, you have the participants, you have the procedures, and you also have the measures. The procedures will tell you about, where data was collected, maybe about how participants were recruited. It'll tell you about the conditions under which data was collected, and the materials, or the measures section, is going to lay out variable by variable each of the measures that were used. It will tell you what types of questions were asked of the participants, and it will also present the psychometrics for those measures. So it'll tell you about reliability and validity and other information that is important. So next after we lay out the method, which is very much the heart of the paper, we get to the analyses, or we get to the results section. It really depends on the article in terms of how, what terminology is used. But if it's analyses or results, what you're going to have is basically an explanation of the findings based on statistical testing of the hypothesis. So you laid out your hypothesis at the end of your introduction in the present study section, and then you are going to pick back up on your hypothesis and explain point by point what you found through your analyses. You're also going to explain what types of analyses you conducted. So if, for example, you did chi-square testings, you would put that there. If you did MANOVAs, you would put that there. You, of course, also have to present descriptive stats. So descriptive statistics are not optional. They're always included in your process. And that's something that's very important for those of you who are doing a quantitative capstone. Now, if you are doing a paper that is qualitative, you would not necessarily have an analysis or results section. You might go straight to a discussion section. Really, for qualitative work, there are different approaches to how to present it. So after the analyses, present your result in numeric form if you're doing a quantitative project, or if then you go into a discussion of your findings. And the discussion section is where you present everything in context. So you are going to talk about what you found and how it compares to what was found in the past. You're going to talk about the implications of your findings. So what is it that we can gather from these particular findings in terms of our understanding of where we should go with future research? What is it that we can get from these findings in terms of our interpretation of past research? And then you end the discussion by talking about the limitations of your study. Limitations typically are outlined by the authors, so there really is no need for you to invent some if you, for example, are asked to analyze research. And the authors lay it out because that's part of the process. It is part of the process. There's a good push towards transparency and towards a better understanding of why it is that certain results are obtained. And that's why it's important that authors lay out the shortcomings, so to speak, of their research. And then you'll have future directions. So the goal is always to end on an optimistic note. So that's why future directions comes after limitations. So you're going to have, the authors discuss what direction they could go into in the future, how they might do the research differently, whether they think a different population would be better, a different age group, whether a different type of measure would be more appropriate, or if maybe changes are needed to the variables, so to the original design, original conception of the study. And finally, you'll sometimes have a conclusion, and the conclusion will really talk about the implications of the findings in terms of the larger context and the importance of the findings. And finally, the paper ends with references. So references in psychology, we follow an APA style formatting throughout the paper. And the references are going to be very important. When you're reading a paper, you should also read the references. So if you were to show me the first page of paper with a title, and you could hide the abstract, you could hide the introduction, but you could, if you show me just the title of the paper and you show me the references, I can typically tell you what discipline the paper is from, what the theory behind it is, and give you all sorts of information, because this is part of what you learn how to do when you gain expertise in your particular field. And so if you're someone who's seeking to go into, further education, if you're thinking about going to a master's program, if you're already in a master's program, or if you're thinking about, doctoral study, or if you're thinking of becoming very specialized in a particular area, read the references so that you can become accustomed to having an understanding of what is presented when it comes to certain topics. So I'm going to give you some easy questions that you can use. So they're fairly, I'm calling them easy, but what I really should call them is straightforward. So they're fairly straightforward questions that you can use when you're reading research to help you gain an understanding of what exactly is being communicated, how and why. I know sometimes you may have professors who tell you you're misinterpreting the research. Well, one surefire way to not misinterpret the research is to use these questions and to read through the articles carefully as you answer them. So the first question is, what topic are the researchers interested in studying? And so that's going to be very important. Sometimes we limit ourselves to giving a one variable answer when more often than not, it's about the relation between variables. And so it's about presenting the topic not just as, oh, the author was interested in studying education, but instead the author was interested in studying public education and its relation to later lifetime achievement or something of that sort. So you are giving an answer that is detailed, you're giving an answer that is precise, you are not skimming over and presenting something that's too generalized. Next, why do authors find this topic to be important? Authors lay that out for you. You do not have to guess. Again, everything is there in the paper. It's part of the background and justification. It's part of the process of writing a background and justification that you explain why a topic is important. What hypotheses are being tested by the authors? The hypotheses will be at the end of the background and justification. Sometimes it'll be in a section labeled the present study. Sometimes they'll just be there as part of the general text. In psychology, we like headers a lot. We use headings a lot. In other fields, you don't necessarily use headings as much. So you may just have to go to the end of the introduction to find your hypotheses. So next question, what is the time frame of data collection? Is it longitudinal? Is it cross-sectional? Is it neither? Longitudinal research is when research is conducted over a longer period of time, and there are maybe 2 data collection points. So longitudinal research will be, for example, when T1 is in 2022, so that's time 1, and then time 2 is going to be at in maybe 2023 or something of that sort, or in the second half of 2022. Cross-sectional is going to be when we compare different sections of data or different cohorts. Neither is when you are just straightforwardly doing some sort of exploratory research. I'm a developmental psychologist. We do a lot of longitudinal work. We do a lot of cross-sectional work in developmental psychology. And it's important to really pay attention to what methods are commonly used in your discipline, because that helps for you to understand why one thing is done as opposed to another thing. I'm the associate director of the psychology program. I'm a developmental psychologist. So for me, we'll do a lot of longitudinal work. We do a lot of work that requires great sensitivity, and that creates a different system than someone who works with a different population. But there are different standards really for how you do research, and you learn about them by reading really. So the more you read research, the better of an understanding you can gain of it. So once you have identified the time frame for data collection, the next thing to do is to be able to describe the procedure and measures used by the researchers. So how did they go about collecting data? Why did they go about it in that way is also something you might want to ask yourself. What measures did they use? Did they conduct clinical interviews? Did they do case studies? Did they use, for example, the Harder measure of gender identity? Did they use the BEM sex roles measure or something of that sort? What exactly did they use as a measure? What exactly were they measuring? After you find out what measures they're using, you want to know about the analyses. So the question is, what types of analyses did the authors run to test their hypotheses? So how exactly did they get their answers? What operations did they do? Do the results support each of the expectations/hypotheses you listed above? Why and why not? And that's very important. Did they find support for the hypotheses they laid out in their background and justification? Next, we get what is a weakness of the study. So as I mentioned, you don't have to guess this, but the authors usually identify it. You may find something else, but it's pretty safe to go with what the authors say is a weakness. And in terms of if you're doing research dissection for an assignment or something of that sort. Next question, and the final question, what might be a reasonable research question to investigate as a follow-up to what was presented in the article? And again, the researchers typically lay that out for you, but you may have your own ideas. And so, this is where you can also make suggestions in terms of what you think would be a good follow-up study. So we have a little time for questions now. I am going to be able to move between slides if you want me to go back to something or cover something in particular. Let me look at the chat and see if there are any questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand and ask me questions about research, general questions about reading, reading for psychology or for another social science. What types of sources you should be using is another question that really connects to this topic today. So post your questions. You can raise your hand. I will kindly ask our events team to point out to me if I miss a question, to point it out to me. Okay, thank you, Molly Joyce, for posting the handout. So there is a handout that goes with this session. And we have 5 minutes if anyone has a question about sources. If you don't have questions, that's okay as well. I can talk to you a little about sources if you want, and what makes for a good source, what does not make for a good source when you're writing a paper and how to identify a primary source from a secondary or tertiary. I can talk about that also. So let me know what you'd like to hear more about. What is a good source? Okay, thank you for the question, Ms. McFall. So a good source, when you're writing a research paper, or any paper for a class, you want to use primary sources most of all, but you can also use secondary sources. So literature reviews, review articles, book chapters are typically going to be, book chapters that present a summary of literature or analysis of literature are typically going to be secondary sources. You want to avoid, I'll start off by telling you what to avoid. You want to avoid anything from the popular press. You want to avoid anything from a .com. So privileged sources that are from peer-reviewed journals, that's number one, that's your top type of a source. Your secondary type of a source will be something from, published manuals or something of that sort, reports from research institutes, so a .org, for example, a report from a .org or a report from a .edu website, those are going to be good sources. Harvard Business Review is pseudo academic. I mean, it's acceptable, but you're in a better position if you have a second source to back it up. It's not, Harvard Business Review is at a better level than, for example, Psychology Today, which is basically People magazine for psychologists. So Harvard Business Review is acceptable, but if you have something else to back it up, that's a good thing, because you want to go for primary sources. And Harvard Business Review, for example, does not publish research, it publishes analysis of research, and in some cases, policy pieces. So you want to, be cautious. These are mostly going to be policy articles, as opposed to policy articles, literature reviews, as opposed to the primary research. In primary research, there's nothing that really can take the place of it. Let me give you an example. So let's say you are writing a paper and you have to talk about Piaget's work. If the assignment is for you to use the materials that are from the course, then you can write about your textbook, write about the material that's in your textbook. You can write about the material that's in your assigned reading. But as a rule, if you write about Piaget, you should cite Piaget directly. As a rule, if you're going to write about Freud, you should cite Freud. If you're writing about Erikson, you should cite Erikson. Now, when you are an undergraduate, there's a little bit more leeway, and your instructors are more forgiving. So they may allow you to cite the textbook as your primary source and not to go to a firsthand source or read Freud directly. When I was an undergrad, we read Freud. Freud's a great writer. I highly recommend reading him. Piaget, not so much. I've read Piaget in English. I've read Piaget in French, and he is great if you need to fall asleep as a writer. But it is worth reading just so that you have an idea of what his actual words are, as opposed to reading 3 different people's interpretation of his words. So another good source, as I mentioned, research institutes, government, so .govs are pretty good for sources. So for example, if you are in IO psychology, the U.S. Department of Labor, the U.S. Office of Labor Statistics is a great place to find information about different professions and about what's going on in terms of the workplace in the United States. APA.org publishes an annual report on, or a report on stress. And so that's worth taking a look at, seeing the report on stress and they talk about stress in the workplace, stress at home, and the impact of stress on different age groups. You can also find really good information from the Pew Research Center. You can find great information from other, Child Mind Institute, and from other different research institutes. MDRC publishes some reports. Circle, there's a bunch of different places. Most professional organizations sometimes commission research. The Society for Research on Child Development, SRCD, it's how we abbreviate it. SRA, Society for Research on Adolescence. I'm once again revealing myself to be a developmental psychologist. So thank you for attending this final Lunch and Learn of the semester. I will be having more lunch and learns next semester. So please, if you have any topic in particular that you'd like me to cover, you'd like me to get over, you are welcome to send an email to psychology@sps.cuny.edu. So it's psychology@sps.cuny.edu, and you can request, that a message be passed on to Isabel Alicia, the Associate Director, about what types of tutorials you would like for Lunch and Learn. We will probably do APA Basics, how to set up your paper next semester again, but I'll leave it up. I'll take your suggestions as to something else you might want covered, and careers are a possibility as well. So the question is, will I be sending out this recording? I will not be sending out the recording personally. SPS is fortunate to have a fantastic events team. We also have a fantastic marketing team, and they do the great work of sending these recordings out and making them available. It's, again, the beauty. So thank you again for coming. I'm going to wish you a very good rest of the day. And I hope to see you next semester. If you're graduating, congratulations. Thank you.